Hello, everyone, from wherever in the world that you are. I'm Rita McGrath, a professor at Columbia Business School, and I'm just so thrilled to have Herminia Ibarra, a dear friend and colleague for many, many years, here with me for our Friday Fireside Chat. A few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'll monitor that as best I can. This session is being recorded, so don't say anything you wouldn't want on the front page of the New York Times. and do feel free to interact. We will be following up with all of you who registered after the session. So welcome, Herminia. I'm so looking forward to this. It's great.
Me too.
And you actually had to break away from a conference to come and join us, so I'm really honored that you decided.
Such a busy life on Zoom these days. It's amazing.
Isn't it incredible? So this is April 10th, everybody, just so you know what date it is. And we are all in lockdown. You're in lockdown in London?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're kind of living at home
with
all your nearest and dearest.
Yes.
So I thought maybe just for our listeners, maybe give just an overview of your work, what you've been doing. I see your great book in the background, and sort of what are the high-level themes that maybe are reflected in the book. Start there, and then we'll get into some of this leader as coach work, which I think is so fascinating.
Fantastic. Right. So I'm Herminia Ibarra. I'm a professor at the London Business School. I'm a career academic. I've been in this field now for 30 years as a professor. And the thing that I've really focused on probably over the last 20 years are the big transitions that we make in our careers, how we shift from doing one kind of work to another, which usually means shifting from one sense of who you are as a professional to another. It's always the ones I'm interested in always touch our sense of identity, which is what makes them hard, because you're not just shifting to using a different tool. It feels sometimes like you're shifting to being a different kind of person almost. And my last book, which is called Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader, is about the transition to bigger leadership roles. And by that, I don't necessarily mean promotion, although it can be. It could be about moving up in a hierarchy. But a lot of times it's also about having broader impact, stepping up in the sense that the environment has changed. I mean, think about that in today's context. The environment has changed dramatically, and therefore what's expected of you has changed accordingly, even if you don't have a new job title to send signals that it's time to change. And the thing that links all of these is that old truism, what got you here won't get you there, coined by our dear friend Marshall Goldsmith, which is, that's precisely it. What gets us stuck is that we've been successful. And when we've been successful, we keep doing the things that made us successful. And there's a perfect parallel to companies, which I will come to. That's how companies get disrupted. They keep doing what they've always done so well and made buckets of money for doing. And so I look at that at the level of people and try to understand what helps and what gets in the way, and what's the process of evolving when it's not just a straightforward learn better presentation skills. It really is a personal transformation by which you come to value what perhaps you didn't value so much before, but by which you come to really seek out a more sophisticated understanding, because you couldn't understand it within the boundaries of what you used to do.
Mm-hmm. So the main message of act like a leader, think like a leader, as I understand it, is you can't think your way into a new way of behaving, that it's the new way of behaving that causes you to change your thought process.
Well, at the end, that's exactly it. At the fundamental, it's really our mindsets about what's worth doing that kind of get in the way, or what's possible or what's feasible. But you can't change a mindset directly because they're the product of your past experience. And so the only way you can actually change your own mind so that you can behave differently is to get some new experiences that start to indicate to you that this may be well worth learning and doing. And so that's why it's shifted. It has nothing to do with acting or putting on a good presentation. It has everything to do with experimenting your way into a new way of thinking. It's almost like a fast prototyping yourself model.
Oh, I love that. One of the things I get asked a lot right now is people are sort of, well, they're stuck, right? What do we do? How do we move forward? What should we be trying? And I keep saying, like, don't aim for some huge megalithic thing, right? Try to articulate what your hypotheses are and then design an experiment or a test which will help you take those hypotheses and turn them into some kind of knowledge, and that you're going to get a lot farther with that. So one of your more recent pieces of work is this fabulous article in Harvard Business Review. I have it here. And it's all about leadership as coaching. And I think it sounds really simple to say, but as I go through the article, there's a lot of complexity and richness to it. So I thought maybe just start off with what was the context for this article? Like,
Yeah,
why now? You know,
that's what I wanted to talk about. You know, it's not, you know, speaking of experimenting, it was not something I set out to do.
because it's a bit of a break from your previous work.
Yes, completely. Although it is one of the things, in one of the skill sets that people need to learn as they move up into bigger leadership roles. They need to learn the art of developing other people on their own terms, of having more open-ended conversations. And so it is part of it. But it is a very different, a very different domain for me. It came out of two different things. And this is interesting. First of all, I have now been looking at how organizations transform for the digital age, and in particular, how leaders can lead more effectively in the context of the enormous changes that are going on in organizations as they try to figure out how to make use of artificial intelligence, how to use technology, how to come up with different business models for this kind of era. So very interested in what that meant for people's jobs and for their roles as leaders and managers. And I started to notice that the more technological change that was going on in these organizations, the more they were also investing in training people across the organization in very basic coaching skills. These things were seeming to come together, whereas coaching used to be the reserve of the senior manager who got to have a little remedial training by, you know, kind of like an external coach who'd come and, you know, I don't know, help them master their temper or something like that. This is a very different kind of coaching. It is helping people throughout an organization get very basic people skills in listening, and not in coaching like a little league coach, but in which you as the expert share with the other what to do, but coaching in the sense of enabling the development of another in terms of where they want to go, helping them come to their own conclusion, helping them find their own solutions to their problems, a kind of a teaching the person to fish kind of solution. So the first thing was, noticing that there was a lot more of this going on in organizations, and that it was a real part of the transformation story of companies like Microsoft, and I'll come back to that, but they were not the only ones. And then the other part of it was just a simple, as a professor, I was starting to teach a class on this. And I realized that there was not a single article that I could assign to students that talked about coaching as building organizational capability, rather than coaching in the traditional, an outsider who helps me with my developmental agenda. And I thought, well, let's just write an article. I mean, the other thing that also drives it is in my daily teaching executives. I always have classes in which you have issues that arise and you ask people to role play a conversation. And it's always disastrous. That's one of the things I talk about in the article. It has been shown in lots of research, not my own, that we think we're so much better than we actually are as coaches. We have no clue how bad we are. But now I can
Lost you there for a minute, Herminia.
Are you with me?
We lost you there for just a second. We were talking about you're not as good as you think you are.
It's very odd. My Wi-Fi has just become unstable, and that's never happened before. So let me just go back. So we think we're good at this, and in fact, we're not. And when we role play it in my classes, it's really comical, because what you always see, I'll tell you, and you can tell me if you've seen it before, what you always see is people who know what they're supposed to do. They know they're not supposed to be command and control leaders. And so they start a conversation with maybe a problem direct report or something, trying to establish a relationship, asking some questions, very magnanimous, very open-ended. And the person doesn't respond like they wanted them to respond. The person says something else. That's not what the answer they were expecting. So they ask another question that starts to be more of a leading question. But the questions get progressively more impossible to answer and a bit more of a leading. And, afterwards, I always say to them, they're never going to say what you wanted them to say. And in fact, if what you want is that answer, stick to command and control. Because the only point of asking questions is to learn something you didn't know, and to be open to the potential for learning, for changing your mind on the basis of what you've learned. And so anyhow, so it was a combination of what I was seeing in my teaching, what I was seeing in the companies that I was working with, and then wanting to assign an article for my students to read on this topic and not finding one. And then I joined forces with the fantastic Anne Scoulard, who's a friend and colleague here in the UK, who started a firm that provides coaching, training, and executive coaching at a very high level. And so she's had years of experience at this, and we developed the article.
That's fantastic. So you talk in the article about situational coaching, and how would you define that differently than perhaps other kinds of coaching? What is it about the situation?
And let me just take a step back. So in the article, we're trying to do two things. One is say, what is coaching if it's not the little league kind? But more importantly, what is talking about how coaching is becoming really a key plank in the learning organization. So it is about the leader as coach, but not just in a self-development way, in the sense of what role you need to play in helping your organization transform. So that's important. So what we're calling situational coaching is something that basically is the right mix of coaching for the needs of the person in that moment. And so some people are real partisans of very non-directive coaching. So you never say what you think. You never provide any bit of advice. You kind of insist that it comes out of the person. That's one style of coaching. The other is more didactic, almost mentoring. It's, I've had 30 years of experience, and here's what I see. If I were you, I'd try this. And so that's directive. The other is non-directive. Situational is you are really able to pull on both of those repertoires in order to help the person as they need it, but not to fulfill your own egotistical needs as the world's expert on this, but it's because you think that this is what the person needs right now.
So a couple of questions from our listeners. One is asking about resources, in addition to your article, would you recommend Marshall Goldsmith's stakeholder-centered coaching as a resource? So think about that for a minute. And then the other question is, can you speak to the role of energy in the organization, the flows of energy through this process? Because, we've all worked with executives who, my daughter would call them fun sponges. They're just like you go into the room and the energy just, they're just exhausting. And then others are really, they provide positive sources of energy and they really get you excited.
Right. So in terms of resources, I'm a huge fan of Marshall stakeholder-centered coaching, but that's not what we're talking about here. No. Stakeholder-centered coaching is about helping an individual executive get better and come up with an agenda that is his or her developmental agenda. This is very basic kind of coaching, allowing people to learn how to listen better and facilitate the other person's ability to come up with a solution that they own and that they are likely to implement. So it's very, very, very basic. I would start, frankly, with our article it has a very kind of historical model for how you do this. It's very, very basic, but I think that's a great place to start. With energy, I mean, again, what we're trying to talk about here is how do you transform an organization that has been very good at doing something and that's no longer as relevant.
Right. They've been good in the past, but that's not going to.
And that's not as relevant. And I think that is the case for almost all of us. I love the way Satya Nadella put it when he talked about shifting from being know-it-alls to being learn-it-alls. So as know-it-alls, yes, of course, you're expert in something, but how does that expertise connect to what your customer wants and therefore connect to what you have to work and do with other colleagues to search and explore and find something to meet those kind of customer needs? And so it is, for me, it is really a process by which everybody in the organization gets engaged in asking questions, not following protocol, not following this is how we've always done, not saying in R&D, here's how we look at things, or in marketing, this is how we approach it, but beginning with what are we trying to accomplish? What's the situation? What are alternatives? What are options? What are the pros and cons? What can we do? And so it really is an approach to release energy across the organization so that people can use their heads and not get stuck, and this is how we've always done it, and start to discover new ways of operating, which is what we all need in the current environment.
You know, you mentioned Satya Nadella at Microsoft, and like many of us who are observing that company, I mean, I've worked with Microsoft for years, and, you know, they are kind of the velociraptors of the tech community. Man, I literally heard somebody at Microsoft say to a person on her team, she said, "Oh, if you leave my team, you are dead to me." And this was to go to work with another group at Microsoft. I mean, it was unbelievable. So maybe for those that aren't familiar with the story, maybe talk a little bit about that story, because I know you've been involved in their transformation effort.
Yeah, it's just it is an amazing story. And you really do see how they have changed. And not, you know, obviously there's the financial story, which is amazing. The share price, which after being flat for a decade, just kind of like lifted. But the reputation of the place, what people are saying about it, its ability to attract top engineers, it really has been a transformation. And, you know, it started very much with Satya Nadella. And there's a couple of things that are really critical. One, he came from the cloud business, so he knew that was the future. The second is he was a very different kind of person, very much a learn-it-all kind of person, very much an inquisitive person. And he knew from being there that the thing that was killing Microsoft was just what you described. It wasn't that they didn't have good people, it's that the politics, they were just fighting each other off rather than fighting the outside competition. And if it didn't have a Windows interface, forget it. And, you know, it was very much kind of in the past. And what he saw was that as you move to the cloud, it changes everything, because first of all, you're serving the client in a very different way. You're going to get paid only for what they use. You can't just sell them boxes of stuff. You have to get them to use it. And to use it, you have to understand what they need so they can add on and use more. And in order to get that, they had to work across the organization, and they had to learn how to do things. I mean, essentially, he said, for us to win in this world of the cloud, we have to get a lot better at learning things we don't know already how to do, rather than executing flawlessly on everything we're beautifully expert on. And so that set in motion a cultural process, which he called being all about growth mindset, which was really the idea that it's not about what you know how to do innately, but it's about what you can learn with effort and with trial and with reaching out, and how to encourage that. Now, that all sounds very, very fuzzy, very nice. And everybody wants a piece of that. So, everybody comes to us and says, yes, we want growth mindset. And it's a very different story when it's not grounded in a real need that has been articulated, that has been identified by a very credible senior person who is role modeling it and working with his people in that very specific way, in showing them what it means. So there's a lot about articulating why is it that we need to do this urgently and importantly. Mm-hmm. And it's not just because it's really sweet and nice to know how to have touchy-feely conversations with people. Right. It's because our survival depends vitally on our ability to have these conversations with our customers, A. B, we're a tech company. We have all kinds of amazing tech tools. So we actually know what's going on. We have real-time data. We have automated forecasts. We have sophisticated artificial intelligence. So what the heck is the manager going to do? There's no point in being kind of the controller and the inspector as we have been in the past. Mm-hmm. The way we utilize those people, the way they can really add value, is by facilitating the development of their people who are on the front lines. And what does that require? Having conversations that pull out of them what they know. And it connects beautifully to our friend Amy Edmondson's ideas about psychological safety. Because part of why Microsoft and so many other companies were not developing the innovations that were shaping their field is because people were afraid to speak up. How is it going to affect my bonus? It's going to piss off my boss. All of these things that get in the way. And this was really a push to make it possible for people, to free up people to say what they thought, to speak their mind, not without pushback, not without challenge, but with a lot of support for that. Mm-hmm. So that's there's a lot in that story, which is how do you take something that we've known and really make it real and tangible to people throughout an organization.
Yeah. So a couple of things on the Microsoft story. Firstly, for those that aren't familiar with the growth mindset term, this was something that was coined by Carol Dweck. And she contrasts what she calls a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, where a growth mindset basically says, how can I use setbacks and learning to get better, versus a fixed mindset, which is how do I demonstrate how good I am, and she really points to the notion of really seeking to learn and seeking to take forward. The other thing about Microsoft, and we'll get to some of the questions in a minute, the other thing about Microsoft that I think is fascinating is how Nadella has been using leading indicators. So if you think about the metrics that you use to drive some kind of decision making in the organization, there's lagging indicators. They're great information about what's already happened. And there's current indicators, which kind of tell you where you are. But then the hardest ones to get are the leading indicators. And so what Nadella did with his whole senior team is he has half of their compensation based on performance. So, sales, revenue, that kind of thing. But the other half is based on what he calls these leading indicators. So things like customer usage. And you go back and he literally talks about customer love. If customers love our products, they'll use them, and that's going to predict our future success. Yeah. And I just thought, so I have to share with you an anecdote. I was invited to speak at one of these big Microsoft leadership meetings, and I get to Bellevue, Washington, get off the plane, go in the big hotel where they're having this, open the door to the ballroom, and on the screen, like in letters as tall as I am, is the word empathy. And having worked with Microsoft for many years, I kind of said, damn, I'm in the wrong ballroom. But no, that was what he was trying to really reinforce. So a couple of questions that have come in are some mistakes made by first-time managers. Could you speak to some of the things that trip up more junior people when they're first stepping into a managerial role?
Gosh, so many things. the thing that most trips up junior people when they first step into a managerial role is that they try to do the work as themselves rather than delegate to other people. And that trips up even more senior managers, quite honestly. But I think that's one of the top things to learn is what do I do myself and what do I delegate? And when you're going to delegate, people trip up there as well because they see it as either I do it myself or I completely throw it over the wall to this person, delegate it to them. But if that person is also inexperienced, they will need some shaping, they will need some encouragement, they will need milestones, they'll need frequent meetings so that they know that they're in sync. And so that to the first-time manager feels like a huge cost in unproductive time, you know. And so it's really accepting the inefficiency that comes at first with learning how to do that.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's always the what got you here won't get you there.
That's great. That's a good watchword for our time. So one question from our viewers is, how do you deal with the reality of right now, especially in the middle of this crisis? You know, you've got leaders who have to let people go. You've got leaders who have to, you know, I mean, there are people who struggle to pay their rent, and you've got leaders who have to say, well, look, we just don't have the money to pay you. How do you keep the kind of social compact intact when you've got to make these really wrenching decisions?
You know, your guess is as good as mine. I think that this is a time when the empathy word has greater meaning than ever. And I think people are finding that they have that in them, even if they hadn't naturally thought of themselves in this way. I think, you know, it is bringing out a lot of the best in humanity as we see all of us being affected in unexpected ways. And I think, you know, in organizations, there's kind of two different things going on right now. One is the kind of like the frantic, how do we, you know, manage the cash situation in kind of crisis mode, the kind of war zone, war room zone. And then there is the people touch and kind of remembering that everybody is a human being who might have a loved one in hospital, or, you know, has a situation going on that is difficult for them in some way. And just keeping that front and center, I think, goes a long ways. But you know, other than what is kind of just a basic humanist perspective on this, I don't know what else I'd share.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I was, in fact, on a call with Alan Mullally, who was at Boeing, and then he was at Ford. Really great leader.
I was on that as well. So
were you on that one? Oh, great. So one of the things he said that I thought was really powerful was he said, you know, if you're able to be transparent, you know, if you really lay out the situation and the facts in front of people, so that they can understand the whole picture, they don't feel like they're being pawns in some sort of chess game that's being played around them. To the extent people feel that they have some control, they have some agency, and they can see the necessity for what you're doing, it makes it a lot. I want to say easier, but you can have a human conversation at that point.
You can have a human conversation. I mean, I think part of what's hard right now is that you don't know. It's, you know, it's not that anybody's trying to be opaque. You just actually don't know how this is going to
There is no information.
Yeah.
No, and that's what I've been telling people, and back to your notion of hypotheses and experiments, that, you know, what we need to do now is create meaning and create understanding where there is none. We do, this is unprecedented. We've never been, at least in my lifetime, in a situation where the entire economy has just ground to a halt, where anything that humans like to do, like getting together, you know, is now mediated by some kind of electronic device.
But at the same time, look at the creativity and innovation that has spawned, and look how adaptable we have been, and how quickly we have all become Zoom masters, and, you know, and all of the different things we'd never expect to be doing. And I think there's a real positive message for that.
I do too. So just to go back to the article, you talk about the grow model in the article. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Because I thought that was really a nice, concise articulation of what the coaching relationship should be like.
Sure, and this is a a model from ancient history
But
is just
we forget history.
it's a really quick and handy way because essentially this idea of non-directive coaching, which is to pull out of the person, to help them, to pull the energy out of them so that they solve their own issue. This kind of non-directive approach can feel like you're spinning your wheels, that it's not going anywhere, that you're having maybe even a kind of very enjoyable conversation, but where is it going? Right. And so what this model does is two things. One, it helps guide you to asking good questions, good open-ended substantive questions that will help the person think. But it also orients you to a flow from identifying a goal or a problem you want to work on to actually what are you going to do stepping out of the meeting immediately. And so it kind of drives you through a conversation that has a shape to it. And so GROW is just an acronym that says you want to start by what's the topic of this discussion? What do we want to talk about? But once you've got your topic, you want to know what is it you're trying to achieve, or what would you like to achieve in this conversation? How can I help you? What would make this conversation have value for you? So that's the goal. The R is the reality. So what's the situation? What's been happening? That's let me give you a little background.
Okay, so that's kind of the context.
That's the context. Mm-hmm. O is options. So what have you tried? What might you try? What are the pros and cons? So what are alternatives? What have you seen other people do? And then W is what will you do? And that is, okay, so given this conversation, what's the next thing you're going to try? Or what phone call are you going to walk out and make? Or what's the conversation that you're going to have? And
moving it towards action.
Moving it towards action. And it's just a flow that goes from identifying what is really the problem that you're trying to solve to what is it that you're going to do.
So the G is the goal. The G is the goal. What's the goal?
R is the reality, the context. Okay. O is the options. And W is the will.
What are you going to do next? I love that.
What will you do? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super important. So a couple of questions have been around how do we learn to develop a growth mindset? What are some things we can do? And I'll chip in here, and then maybe you have some thoughts on that. So one of the things that a colleague of mine uses a lot is she calls it if-then. And what I think is fascinating about this is how she's sort of using our unconscious brains. So if it is 4:00, I will return that customer phone call. If it is Tuesday, I will book my exercise appointment. If it is, and what she found was that that people that used if-then planning actually followed through in terms of the will, what are you going to do, much more regularly than people that just sort of said, yeah, I'll get to that, right? Because what happens, and I thought this was fascinating, in your brain, like your brain is kind of going, oh, it's 3:00, it's 3:30, it's 3:40. Wasn't there something I was supposed to be doing at 4:00? And it's completely unconscious. And I thought that was a really interesting, very sort of pragmatic way of using this growth mindset idea to actually get yourself to do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it ties back to the old idea that the more specific you can be in terms of what you're going to do, that in jargon, it's implementation intentions, the more likely it is that you're going to do it, the more it's kind of fuzzy. I'm going to be a better listener. Yeah. The less likely it is.
What does that mean, right? To be a better listener.
And brings you to a specific, I'm going to do it at this time, on this date, or, whenever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the growth mindset question, how do we develop more of a growth mindset? It's a really good question. One of the things we need to understand, it's a hugely compelling concept. There's been almost no research done on growth mindset outside the school setting. It was research that was originally done in schools on kids. Why is it that some kids faced with challenging academic work just shut down? And why is it that others thrive on the challenge? Some will say, I'm just not good at maths. Others will say, I have to try harder. And then that started getting extended to research on, for example, when do women persist in STEM fields in college and when do they not? Or but it's only very recently that people have started doing research on this in an organizational context. Very little of it is happening. The bit that has been done has been connecting it to organizational culture, and the extent to which actually an organizational culture that's defined by adaptability is very much one that subscribes to a growth mindset idea. So the real convergence between some of the ways in which we traditionally look at corporate cultures and how it kind of plays out in people's mindsets. Because one of the things that the psychologists found is that mindsets are not just the product of your own head and your own background. Context, signal, growth, or fixed. And so that's where the organizational aspect comes in. Part of what was happening at Microsoft is that, first of all, the way they did performance appraisal, the hated stack produced a sense of fixed mindset. I either have it or I don't, as opposed to a learning experience is valued and I can grow from it. Once they changed that, for example, they made it possible for people who had failed in ways that created valuable learning to get bonus nevertheless. That was not possible before in the way that they did things. So
just to catch you for a minute there. So for those that might not be familiar with this, there was a personnel evaluation system which was popularized originally by GE, which basically said you sort everybody into kind of overperformers, middle rank, and then the bottom. And the bottom was supposed to be cut off. It was called rank and yank was one of the buzzwords, or a number of different ways it's called. And the research that I've read on it anyway, and I don't know if you have a different view, but the research I've read is like every so often doing that is kind of useful, because over time you sort of accumulate clutter, right? And so having some kind of performance standard, but if you use it repeatedly, it has all these super negative effects.
So you cut to the bone, you have, right, exactly. And, and as it turned out, they were just, and this is where it gets interesting in the connection to the corporate culture, there were all kinds of things that they did as an organization that were communicating a fixed mindset, a know-it-all mindset, just perform to the hilt and don't clutter any of this up with learning or mistakes. And one of the things we talk about in the article is that you don't instill this kind of coaching culture without removing serious barriers that are in just the normal ways in which you do things. And if I can tell one of the anecdotes here, because I think it really makes the point, it took them a while to realize that one of the things that they still had in place at Microsoft, the way they did quarterly business review meetings, was no matter how much progress they had made on everything else, that always brought them back to the old fixed mindset of perform, look perfect, know everything, be bulletproof. They had what they called it the mid-year quarterly review, which happened in February. And it killed off everybody's Christmas holiday because they had to spend months preparing for this. They were preparing slide decks of 100 slides. And what you had was, local teams preparing regional teams, preparing the global teams, each time kind of cranking it up to this, huge event with the CEO in which people were presenting their business. And the old tradition was precision questioning, kind of being hammered on, do you know this data? And what about that figure? And what about this? And the whole thing was a show. It was a way that it used to maybe be a good way of learning, but now they have real-time data on these very sophisticated, smart tools. They know what's going on. They didn't need all of that performance. Right. And it was killing off. And, for them, the formula, it always goes back to what are we trying to accomplish that's critical. It came back to their customers. They knew the more time people spent with their customers, the more they would do on the cloud with Microsoft, the more their services and products they would use. And what was keeping them from spending time with their customers to learn these things is all this internal political stuff, preparing PowerPoint decks of 100 slides, for example. And so
crazy, isn't it?
they realized that it was not productive, but that it was also reinforcing the fixed mindset culture of put on a good show at all costs. That was not a forum in which you could sit back and say, all right, what did we learn here?
Right.
That's not,
That's great. That's great.
That's all a long-winded way of saying that there's a lot in the context that's signaling.
That's interesting.
A growth mindset versus a fixed mindset.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting comment, because I think with a lot of these sort of people issues, we're all about fixing the people, and we don't look enough at fixing the context or the situation. So I wanted to touch on two things, and I know I've got to let you go fairly soon. But one is, could you just review for everybody sort of Coaching 101, right, which is one of the boxes, I think, in the article. The other thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is some years back you wrote a wonderful piece about women and the vision thing, and women not being seen as visionary. And that was a while ago, and I'd love you to just kind of reflect on, that was then. Has anything gotten different now? Have we improved? Have women come forward or anything like that? So two things. So Coaching 101 and what's happened with women in the vision thing.
So give me some guidelines. What do you mean by Coaching 101?
Well, that was a box in your article. It was kind of like, what are the basics, the building blocks of building a good coaching relationship?
Asking good questions, being a good listener, pulling yourself out of the equation and being very focused on what is the other person telling you, what does the other person need, what is it that I don't know, as opposed to, trying to be adding value because that's what you're there to do as an expert. But the basics are really basics of human communication. How it's a bit like appreciative inquiry, questions that you can ask that allow the person that are kind of based from the point of view that they know what they're talking about, that they can solve their problems, that they have something of value to offer. So really listening and asking questions are the fundamentals. And it sounds easy, but I have to say, I did a coaching training about 5 years ago, and it was really interesting to see. I didn't know how to ask good questions. My questions were clunky. They were not straightforward. I often was asking yes or no questions as opposed to open-ended questions that allow people to elaborate. And so there's a real art to asking good questions. One of our colleagues, Hal Gregerson, has a lot about this. And so it's really worth investing in getting better at asking good questions.
And I can highly recommend any of you who want to get better at this. Hal Gregerson's a great resource. He publishes, I think it's a monthly newsletter talking about, I think it's called Glad You Asked. and he's very accessible, a lovely person, and would be good to learn from on this topic.
Yeah. On women in the vision thing, I don't know what to say. I haven't looked at those data again since then. And this is a very long conversation. So we just do know that even though we see progress, gender bias, implicit bias is still very strong. And so the specific form it will take will always vary. So, at that time, because you had still very few women at the C-suite level, women tended to be seen as not visionary by their male colleagues, by the way, not their female colleagues. And I don't know if that's still the case today on a kind of an aggregate level, but I do know that what we've seen over the decades is whatever is the thing that's being valued, that's the thing that women are seen as having less of. And I think that there is plenty of evidence. And, a lot of the great research on that is coming out of things that have to do with VC funding and women entrepreneurs, and we're seeing a lot of those biases sadly still there. But ask me something else so we can end on a more upbeat note.
Well, I think I know you're at a conference right now about sort of with a lot of heavy hitters about the future and so forth. So perhaps share with our listeners, something that you think is really positive coming out of the current sort of mashup we're all in right now.
Right. Well, this is a true disruption and not a disruption in the, kind of the way we throw words around. And by that, I mean there is a before and an after that's clear. We have all been thrown out of our habitual work context. Our habits have been disrupted. So there's, those are the things that can make us either kind of get very conservative and rigid because we feel under threat, or they can make us think differently, be more creative. And, of course, which way it goes depends on your nest egg and depends on whether you have a lovely house from which to work at home and everything else. It depends on a lot of those things. However, there is a huge opportunity to learn from this experiment and to use it to try some new things. And maybe not right away, maybe not immediately. I think a lot of us have just been coping, learning Zoom, among other things. But I think there's a huge opportunity. I mean, I know, just this conference that I'm in, it was supposed to happen at George Mason University in Washington, D.C., and we were all going to travel there. And it got shifted to Zoom. And I have to say, I'm enjoying it very much. And it really is making me question, do I want to travel to conferences going forward? I'm not so sure. I kind of like going from my living room. So
my commute now is my library to my study. So I think one of the things that is so important to think about now is we're really experiencing a great unfreezing. An opportunity to really get away from, we've always done it this way, or, routines sort of get baked in and it's effortful to change them. We've all made the investment in working this way. And I think it'll be, it's going to open up a lot of opportunities that we didn't see before. Well, look, I won't hold you anymore. This has been such fun. Thank you for joining me.
Rita, thank you very
Get
much.
the article, folks.
I saw the names I know on the attendees, so thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you, absolutely.
Bye.
And enjoy the rest of the weekend. Right? Bye.
Likewise, bye.